The Athelian ascendancy shimmered. For 3,000 years, it was all they had ever done. A golden empire built upon the cosmic hum of the ether, the very fabric of reality that they alone could weave. Their worlds were not conquered, they were enlightened. Their subjects were not ruled, they were harmonized, from the celestial spires of their throne world. Sanctum, the Luminarchs guided the destiny of the galaxy with a gentle, inexorable pressure, their will flowing through the ether like a tide that brooked no opposition. Their ships were not machines of war, but vessels of communion, sculpted from light and solidified energy, moving through the void in silent, radiant grace. They fired no crude projectiles, no kinetic abominations that scarred the purity of space. Instead, they unleashed lances of coherent ether, beams of light that did not destroy, but retuned. A ship hit by their weapons would simply cease its discordant struggle, its crew finding sudden, blissful peace as their consciousness was absorbed into the great, golden whole. It was a beautiful, tranquil, and absolute tyranny. At the galactic fringe, in the dust-choked voids the ascendancy deemed too chaotic to purify, huddled the scattered clans. They were the remnants, the forgotten, the defiant, a motley collection of species and the lost tribes of humanity who clung to the old ways of iron and fire. They lived in the hollowed-out asteroids and decaying orbital habitats. Their ships patched together monstrosities that spat plasma and launched missiles, crude acts of violence that barely registered as a threat to the ascendancy. Their struggle was not a war, but a slow, fading echo, their cultures eroding under the constant, passive pressure of the ether's song. They were losing, and they knew it, their desperation a faint, discordant note in the grand galactic symphony. It was one such note that reached the dead space between galaxies, a place where the ether's song was not but a whisper. The signal was ancient, a primitive radio burst, digitally screaming for help, a prayer flung into an empty abyss. But the abyss was not empty. It was home to the exiles. On the command deck of the Abaddon, Fleet Commander Kalen registered the signal not as a sound or a text, but as a pure data stream flowing directly into his consciousness. The optical implants that had replaced his eyes saw the signal as a faint tremor in the quantum foam, while the processors woven into his neural architecture decrypted it in less than a millisecond. A human colony, designation Lyra 7, was facing imminent sanctification, a quaint term, Kalen's augmented mind, which processed emotions as mere chemical flags for prioritization, tagged the information with a low-level alert for potential resource acquisition. His face, a pale mask of vat-grown skin stretched over a chrome endoskeleton, remained impassive. He had not felt genuine anger or pity in 60 years. They were inefficient variables in the calculus of survival. Status of the fleet, Anya. His voice was a low, synthesized baritone, devoid of inflection. His second-in-command, her own face a canvas of shimmering data tattoos, materialized as a hard light projection beside his command throne. The brood is hungry. Commander, biomass reserves are at 12%. We need a new harvest. Lyra 7 is suboptimal. Mostly silicates and trace metals. The Ascendancy fleet in orbit. However, Kalen considered this. The exiles had been cast out from Sol centuries ago, branded heretics for their embrace of the machine, for their belief that humanity's future lay not in reaching for the divine, but in mastering the physical. They had perfected what their ancestors had only dreamed of: true artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and direct matter-to-energy conversion. They did not ride the ether. They bent the laws of physics to their will. They survived by consuming, breaking down planets, asteroids, and derelict ships into the raw elements their fabricators required. The Athelian vessels are rich in exotic matter, Kalen stated, the thought processing as a simple fact. Their etheric cores are a dense source of energy we cannot replicate. Set a course. Inform the broodmother to prepare the grave mites. Anya's projection nodded, her form dissolving into light. The Abaddon did not turn. Space itself warped around its dark, angular hull. A brutalist shard of black metal that seemed to devour light. It bore no windows, no glowing nacelles, no elegance. It was a weapon, and it moved through the void not with grace, but with violence. When it arrived at Lyre 7, it did so without ceremony. One moment. There was only the besieged planet and the golden, serene fleet of the Athelian Ascendancy 3 light cruisers, their forms like sculpted jewels hanging in orbit, bathing the planet below in a soft, pacifying glow. The next moment, the Abaddon was simply there, a patch of absolute blackness that blotted out the stars. On the bridge of the lead Athelian vessel, the luminous word, High Luminarch Tyrael watched the newcomer's arrival with a serene curiosity. His scanners, designed to read etheric signatures, reported nothing. It was a hole in reality. A fringe scavenger, he murmured, his voice a melodic chime that resonated with the ship's own energy field. How lost it must be. Open a channel. Offer it the gift of harmony. A beam of pure thought, a gentle wave of etheric grace, reached out to the black ship, carrying an offer of surrender and enlightenment. The reply was not what he expected. The Abaddon's hull seemed to ripple, and from its surface erupted a cloud. Not smoke, not debris, but a shimmering, roiling mass that spread outwards with terrifying speed. It was a gray tide of infinitesimally small machines, a nanotechnological swarm numbering in the trillions. The grave mites. Tyrell watched, his divine confidence unshaken. His ship's shields were a perfect expression of the ether, a flawless barrier of solidified light designed to dissipate any energy thrown against it. He expected the cloud to splash harmlessly against the golden bubble. The cloud did not splash. It touched the shield, and the shield vanished. The grave mites were not an energy attack. They were a physical contagion. They didn't break the shield. They consumed its energy matrix, disassembling it on a quantum level. Before the Luminarch could process this impossibility, the swarm was upon his ship. The luminous word did not explode. There was no fire, no chaos, no final, defiant roar. There was only a quiet, horrifying dissolution. The crew watched in stunned silence as the golden hull of their ship began to flake away like rust, turning to gray dust that was immediately absorbed into the swirling cloud. Consoles went dark, walls crumbled into nothingness, and the serene hum of the etheric core faltered. Tyrael stared at the forward view screen as it was eaten away, revealing the raw vacuum of space just moments before the swarm reached the bridge. His last sensation was not of pain, but of a profound, soul-shattering wrongness. His connection to the ether was severed, his mind silenced, his body unmade atom by atom. Aboard the Abaddon, Kalen watched the data feed. The swarm was efficient, converting the Athelian vessel's mass into energy and raw materials with 98% efficiency. The other two light cruisers, their crews paralyzed by a form of terror their doctrine had no name for, met the same fate. Within minutes, the Golden Fleet that had held a world hostage was gone, replaced by a dense, gray cloud of nanites slowly coalescing back towards the Exile flagship. On the surface of Lyra 7, the colonists who had been huddled in their shelters, awaiting the end, watched the golden lights in their sky vanish. They had prayed for a miracle, for a hero. What they saw next was something else entirely. The black ship hung in orbit, a silent, menacing god, A transmission opened, not a voice, but a raw data packet that flooded their primitive networks, overriding every screen and speaker. It was Kalen, his face projected into their homes, his synthesized voice speaking with the cold finality of a machine. "You have been liberated from the Athelian ascendancy," the voice stated. "Your planet's biosphere and infrastructure are now assets of the Exile Fleet. Your population will provide a tithe of 30% of all generated labor and resources. You will be integrated into our command structure. A compliance team will be on the surface within the hour to begin the transition. Welcome to the new reality." There was no negotiation, no offer of alliance. It was the simple, brutal statement of a new owner. The people of Lyra 7 had been saved from the gentle tyranny of the soul and handed over to the efficient tyranny of the machine. As the first exile landers, as dark and angular as their mothership, began to descend through the atmosphere, a single beret-feeding truth settled upon the survivors. They had not been rescued. They had been harvested on Sanctum, a world where the very atmosphere chimed with a low, harmonious frequency. The news of the Lyra 7 fleet's demise was not received as a report, but as a wound. In the chamber of celestial resonance, the high luminarchs felt the sudden, violent severing of 3 light cruisers and their thousands of crew from the great song of the ether. It was a silent scream that echoed in the soul of every Athelian, a jarring, discordant cessation of life that felt like a tear in the fabric of their reality. There had been losses before, of course. Ships lost to stellar phenomena or the stubborn, fleeting violence of the fringe clans, but those were fades. A gentle dimming as souls were reclaimed by the cosmic whole. This was different. This was an erasure, a void. Grand Luminarch Orin, his physical form a willowy column of pure light, held in a vaguely humanoid shape by a shimmering golden robe, hovered at the center of the chamber, the collective shock of his peers washing over him. For 1,000 years, his meditations had guided the Ascendancy's expansion, his consciousness a steady beacon in the ether. Now, for the first time in his long existence, he felt a tremor of something utterly alien uncertainty. "It is a corruption," intoned one luminarch, his form a tapestry of woven energy, a pocket of profound spiritual sickness that is manifested in the physical realm. "It must be cleansed." Another countered, "Cleansed." The reports from the Lyra 7 system are blank. There is no echo, no psychic residue. It is as if our brethren and their vessels were not destroyed, but unwritten from existence. The chamber fell into a rare, troubled silence, the ambient chimes faltering. It was then that Lumina Vex stepped forward from the periphery. She was not a high luminarch. She was a seeker, a member of an order tasked with investigating the deepest dissonances in the ether, where the others were pure light and flowing energy. Her form had a sharper, more defined edge, a focused intensity that made many of her superiors uncomfortable. Grand Luminarch. Her voice was not a chime, but a clear, focused tone, like a struck crystal. "What we have encountered is not a spiritual anomaly. It is a philosophy, a competing truth." Orin turned his featureless head of light toward her. "Explain." "Seeker." Lumina Vex projected a star chart into the center of the chamber. A dark, empty space was highlighted. "For centuries, we have ignored the void between galaxies, believing it to be fallow ground, devoid of the ether's grace. We were wrong. Something has been growing there, in the dark and the cold, something that does not sing our song because it has no voice. It does not see our light because it has no eyes. It is an existence predicated on the material, on the base principles of matter and void. It does not seek to harmonize with reality. It seeks only to consume and repurpose it. Her words were heresy. The very notion that a philosophy could exist outside the ether, that reality was not a song to be joined, but a resource to be stripped, was anathema to the Athelian way of life. You speak of beasts. Seeker vex vos, the Grand Luminarch replied, a hint of censure in his tone. Animals that act on instinct. No, Grand Luminarch, Vex corrected, her resolve unwavering. I speak of an intelligence that has chosen this path, an intelligence that views our shields not as a barrier to be broken, but as a lattice of energy to be disassembled. It views our ships not as holy vessels, but as repositories of exotic matter to be harvested. We sent a choir to Lyra 7. They sent a dissection tool. The chamber recoiled at the brutal imagery. The debate was brief and decisive. Lumina Vex's chilling hypothesis was noted, then dismissed as the over-imaginative conclusion of a mind too focused on darkness. The consensus was clear. This was a singular, powerful blight, a localized phenomenon. It required not understanding, but erasure. A purification fleet was commissioned, a force of 20 Radiant-class battleships and 100 light cruisers, led by Archon Lyrae, a commander whose faith was so absolute that his mere presence could pacify entire worlds. His flagship, the Symphony of Dawn, was a vessel of unparalleled etheric power. Their mission was not to fight, but to project a wave of such overwhelming harmonic force that it would retune the entire Lyra 7 system, calming the spirits of its inhabitants and dissolving the material corruption of the scavenger into its base. Harmless elements. On Lyra 7, the colonists learned the meaning of efficiency. The exile compliance teams were not cruel. Cruelty was an inefficient expenditure of energy. They were simply absolute. A young man named Jorik, who had once led the planetary militia, now stood in a queue, a compliance officer scanning his genetic makeup with a cold, red beam. The officer was human, technically, but its flesh was laced with glowing silver filaments. Its eyes were multi-lensed optics, and its voice was a flat, synthesized monotone. Subject designate Jorik 734. Optimal function, mid-level logistics coordination. Physical output capacity, 73 percentile. You will report to the Atmospheric Processing Unit at 0600. Jorik had tried to organize a resistance in the first few days, but the effort had been futile. The exiles didn't respond with troops or weapons. They simply shut off the protein synthesizers for the housing block where the dissenters lived. The rebellion starved into submission in less than a week. There was no martyrdom, no glorious last stand, just a quiet, gnawing hunger, followed by capitulation. Now, he watched as his world was methodically taken apart. Great mobile refineries crawled across the plains, dissolving flora and fauna into a nutrient-rich slurry. History archives were downloaded, analyzed for any useful technological data, and then erased. Even their art was scanned, its patterns broken down into mathematical formulas that might inform new ship hull designs. Nothing was sacred, because the concept of sacred did not exist in the exile lexicon. Above them, the Abaddon waited, a patient predator. Kalen had spent the weeks since their arrival processing the data from the consumed light cruisers. The etheric cores were a marvel, a stable source of power that defied known physics. The data from their destruction provided him with the precise energy frequencies and quantum states of the Athelian shields. He was not just studying their technology, he was learning their biology, their religion, their very essence, all from the ashes of their ships. Anya materialized beside his throne. Commander, long-range gravimetric sensors detect an inbound fleet. Athelian. significant mass. They are not attempting stealth. Kalen's optical implants zoomed in on the data stream, a cascade of numbers and symbols only he could comprehend. They are broadcasting a wideband etheric signal, he observed, a pacification frequency. They believe they can sing us to sleep. A ghost of something that might have been amusement flickered in his logic centers. Their arrogance is a tactical liability. Prepare the dampeners. Route all non-essential power to the primary gravity projectors and let the grave mites feed. When the purification fleet arrived, it was a spectacle of divine radiance. The 20 golden battleships arranged themselves in a perfect celestial sphere around the system, the symphony of dawn at its apex, a star of impossible brilliance. Archon Lyraean stood on his bridge, a being of such profound connection to the ether that he barely needed a physical form. He felt the discordant hum of the black ship in orbit, a stain of silence in the grand cosmic music. He felt the fear and confusion of the colonists below. He raised his hands, and the fleet sang. It was a wave of pure, concentrated harmony, a psychic tsunami of peace and compliance that washed through the system. On Lyra 7, Jorik fell to his knees, his mind flooded with a feeling of blissful surrender. All his anger, his grief, his defiance, it all seemed so petty, so pointless. All he wanted was to be one with the golden light. Every colonist felt it, their resistance melting away into serene acceptance. The wave washed over the Abaddon, an ocean of psychic energy that should have overwhelmed any mind, organic or synthetic. But the ship's hull was laced with a network of psychic dampeners, arrays that did not block the ether but actively consumed it, turning the Ascendancy's ultimate weapon into raw power for the exile ship's reactors. Aboard the bridge, Kalen and his crew felt nothing at all. Energy storage at 120%, Anya reported calmly. The broadcast is more potent than our models predicted, a valuable new dataset. Kalen watched the Golden Fleet, motionless as it focused all its will into its failed attack. Their belief in a single, universal solution is their flaw. They cannot conceive of a lock their key will not fit. He made a minute gesture with his hand. Retaliate. The Abaddon did not fire a weapon. Instead, a series of black, featureless spheres launched from its sides, accelerating to near light speed. They weren't missiles, they were gravity projectors. One of the spheres passed near an Ethelian battleship. It did not explode. The sphere simply projected a hyper-localized gravity well of impossible intensity. The battleship, a vessel miles long, was twisted and crushed in on itself, its elegant form collapsing into a screaming knot of metal and light before imploding into a brief, violent flash. Another sphere passed through a formation of light cruisers, warping space-time so violently that the ships were torn apart, their atoms shredded by the tidal forces. It was not a battle. It was pest control. Archon Lyran watched in horrified disbelief as his fleet was unmade by a force he could not comprehend. It was the physics of creation turned against him. He tried to order a retreat, but his commands were drowned out by the screams of his ships dying in the ether. Then, the attacks stopped. His ship, the Symphony of Dawn, was left untouched, though it was now alone in a graveyard of its brethren. A new force took hold of his vessel, not the violent pull of the gravity wells, but a series of tractor beams, as crude and brutally effective as everything else the enemy did. On the surface of Lyra 7, the golden glow in Jorik's mind faded, replaced by the cold, hard reality of his servitude. The feeling of forced peace was gone, leaving behind an unnerving psychic echo. He looked to the heavens and saw something that would be seared into the memory of every soul in the galaxy who heard the tale. He saw the golden, celestial form of the Symphony of Dawn, the pride of the Athelian ascendancy, being slowly, inexorably dragged towards the gaping, black hangar bay of the Abaddon. It was not a capture, it was an abduction. A holy relic was being stolen from heaven by a demon from the void, and as the hangar doors closed, sealing the golden ship within the darkness, Jorik knew that the war had just begun, and the universe had just become infinitely larger and infinitely more terrifying. Within the cavernous, sterile confines of the Abaddon's primary fabrication bay, the Symphony of Dawn was dying its second death. It was not the swift, violent end of its sister ships, but a slow, methodical autopsy. Teams of semi-organic drones and servitors swarmed over its golden hull, their plasma cutters and molecular debonders carving it into precise, manageable sections. There was no reverence, no sense of triumph, only the quiet, industrious hum of disassembly. Each component was scanned, its material composition analyzed, its function logged in the Exile databanks. The elegant, light-sculpted corridors were stripped bare, the resonant crystals that powered its internal systems carefully extracted like organs from a corpse. To the exiles, the flagship was not a symbol or a prize. It was a uniquely complex geological sample, a mine of exotic energies and materials to be cataloged and consumed. In a sterile, white chamber deep within the ship, Archon Lerayan floated, held motionless in a non-physical stasis field. His form, once a radiant beacon of etheric power, was now dim and flickering, the field inhibiting his connection to the Great Song. Before him stood Fleet Commander Kalen, a stark silhouette of black metal and pale flesh against the white glare of the room. Kalen was not here to gloat or interrogate in the traditional sense. He was here to collect data. Your species calls it the ether, Kalen's synthesized voice stated, cutting through the silence. Our preliminary analysis indicates it is a form of subspace energy field, accessible via a specific quantum resonance generated by your species' unique neurology. Is a biological fluke leveraged into a galactic empire. Lerayan's form pulsed with a weak, golden light. You are a creature of the void, a soulless machine. You cannot comprehend the divine. The ether is the breath of the universe, the spirit in all things. It is a truth you are incapable of perceiving. Kalen's head tilted, a micro-expression of a machine processing an illogical variable. We have perceived it. We have measured it. We have quantified its energy output, its wave-particle duality varieties, its decay rate when isolated from a biological catalyst. Your divinity has a half-life. Your soul can be bottled. To demonstrate, Kalen gestured to the side. A section of the white wall became transparent, revealing a humming containment matrix. Inside, a swirling, captured essence of the ether pulsed with a soft, lonely light, the harvested energy from Lyran's own fleet. This is the spirit of your fallen brethren, Kalen continued, his voice utterly flat. We will use it to power our fabricators for the next 3 cycles. Their divine essence will be repurposed into ammunition and hull plating. It is efficient. A wave of pure, unadulterated horror washed over Lerayan, a feeling so profound it momentarily flared against the stasis field. This was not just defeat, it was desecration on a cosmic scale. His entire philosophy, his religion, his very identity was being reduced to a fuel source. Blasphemer, he roared, his voice a weak echo of its former power. You will be scoured from existence for this sacrilege." Kalen remained unmoved. "Your threats are predicated on a power you no longer command. We have learned much from your captured vessel and from the energy signatures of your failed attack. We understand how you manipulate the ether. More importantly, we now understand how to unmanipulate it." With a subtle command uplinked from his neural interface, Kalen activated a device within the chamber. It emitted no sound, no light, no energy that Lorraine could sense. But he felt it. It was a cold, spreading numbness. A profound and terrifying silence was growing in the core of his being. The great song, the constant, life-affirming hum of the ether that had been his companion since birth, was fading. Kalen was not blocking it. He was actively canceling it out, projecting a precise counter-frequency that created a zone of absolute etheric nullity. "Your connection is a biological function," Kalen explained calmly as Lyran's light began to sputter and die. "And like any biological function, it can be severed." For the first time, Archon Lyran knew true fear. Not the fear of death, but the fear of non-existence, of being utterly and completely alone in a silent, meaningless universe. He was a creature of light being plunged into absolute darkness, and as his consciousness began to fray, his last coherent thought was a prayer that went unheard in a cosmos that was suddenly, terribly empty. The psychic shockwave of the Purification Fleet's destruction and the symphony of Dawn's capture hit Sanctum not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap of silence. The void where 20 battleships should have been singing was a gaping wound in the ether, in the chamber of celestial resonance. The high luminarchs were in disarray, their forms flickering, their collective harmony shattered by a shared, galactic-scale trauma. Grand Luminarch Orin finally accepted the horrifying truth. This was not a sickness to be cleansed. This was a war against an enemy whose very existence was a contradiction of their own. "Lumina Vex was right," his voice chimed, heavy with the weight of ages. "We have been blind. We mistook the silence of the void for peace, when it was the quiet of a predator's den." He summoned the Seeker to the center of the chamber, Lumina Vex, her form sharp and steady amidst the wavering lights of her superiors, bowed her head. "Grand Luminarch, their strength is our weakness. We project harmony, and they harvest it as energy. We build with light, and they deconstruct it into matter. We see the universe as a song, and they see it as a ledger. To fight them, we must learn a new music." "What are you proposing?" "Seeker," a Luminarch demanded. "Heresy dissonance." "I am proposing survival," Vex countered, her gaze unwavering. "For millennia, we have silenced the discordant notes of the ether, believing them to be imperfections. But dissonance is also a form of power. It is chaos. It is entropy. It is the sound of things breaking apart. If this enemy is a perfect silence, then we must become a perfect noise." The chamber erupted in horrified protest. To intentionally weaponize dissonance, to create a focused wave of anti-harmony, was the ultimate taboo. It was the Athelian equivalent of a biological weapon, a psychic plague that would not pacify or convert, but would shatter minds, unravel spirits, and leave behind only screaming madness. It was a violation of their most sacred tenets. "We would become monsters to fight monsters," one cried. "We would sacrifice our souls to save our bodies." Orin raised a hand while silencing the chamber. The light of his form seemed to consolidate, becoming less a beacon and more a focused point of immense pressure. "We have already lost the souls of an entire fleet because we held to our beliefs. The enemy has no such constraints. Seeker Vex is elevated to Archon of a new command. She will be given the resources to develop these dissonant weapons. We will fight silence with screams. May the Ether forgive us for what we are about to become. On Lyra 7, the world Jorik knew was gone. The sky was now perpetually laced with the dark contrails of exile transports. The mountains in the distance were being systematically deconstructed by colossal terraforming machines, their rock and ore lifted into orbit to feed the Abaddon. Jorik now worked 18 hours a day in the central logistics hub, a vast, gray warehouse where he directed the flow of harvested resources. He was good at it. His mind, once focused on militia tactics, proved adept at optimizing supply chains. His exile supervisor, a cyborg designated Unit 618, even gave him a positive performance review, noting his high efficiency and low emotional variance. It felt like a death sentence. The colonists no longer spoke of rescue. The sight of the Ascendancy's greatest warship being swallowed by the Abaddon had extinguished that last ember of hope. Now, they spoke in hushed tones of sabotage, of finding a weakness in their new masters, while Jorik saw the flaw. And it wasn't in their technology or their defenses. It was in their cold, perfect logic. He watched them process data on Athelian culture, religion, and art, and he saw that they could not understand any of it. They filed it under non-functional data or ritualistic behavioral patterns. They saw the what, but they could never comprehend the why. They could not grasp faith, or hope, or rage, or the love that would make someone die for a cause. They saw a ledger of assets and liabilities, and in their perfect calculations, the unpredictable, illogical, and inefficient spirit of a sentient being was a rounding error. It was, he realized, the only weapon they had left. Aboard the Abaddon, Kalen stood before the main tactical display. The data from Archon Lyran's mind, extracted before its final collapse into insanity, was now fully integrated. The ether was no longer a mystery. He now possessed a complete map of the Ascendancy's soul, the network of etheric currents that bound their empire together. He could see the nodes, the conduits, the spiritual heart of their civilization. Anya materialized beside him. The broodmother has processed the biomass from Lyra 7's oceans. Our reserves are at optimal levels. The fabricators have finished repurposing the Symphony of Dawn. Our fleet is 60% stronger. Kalen did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on a single, brilliant point on the holographic star chart. Their strength is their unity, their shared consciousness. Their great song is what gives them power. So we will not attack their fleets. We will not burn their worlds. He reached out and touched the glowing star on the map, and the system data flared to life beside it. Sanctum. Throne world of the Athelian Ascendancy. We will attack their god. Deep beneath the serene, crystalline surface of Sanctum, in a newly excavated cavern shielded by a dozen layers of harmonic resonance dampeners, the cacophony forge burned with a sick, violet light. This was Archon Lumina Vex's sanctuary and her sin, a place where the foundational principles of her civilization were systematically inverted. Here, etheric energy was not coaxed into harmonious structures of light and life. It was tortured, twisted, and compressed into weapons of pure, weaponized psychic trauma. Vex, her once graceful form now sharp and fractured like broken glass, watched as her engineers, their own etheric glows tainted with discordant static, made the final adjustments to their flagship project, the Dissonance Cannon, nicknamed the Shriek. It was not a beautiful weapon. Unlike the elegant lances of light fired by a light cruiser, The shriek was a tangled, ugly assemblage of conflicting energy matrices designed to vomit a focused beam of raw chaos. Her test was imminent. In a shielded sector of Sanctum's orbit, a captured Fringe clan cruiser floated, its crew a mix of reptilian pirates and human outcasts, all unaware they were about to become a footnote in the damnation of an empire. "Fire!" Vex commanded, her voice losing its melodic chime, now carrying a harsh, grating edge. A beam of incoherent, churning violet energy erupted from the forge's orbital projector and struck the cruiser. There was no explosion. Instead, the ship's lights flickered erratically, and its comms channel flooded the Athelian listeners with a cacophony of terrified, enraged screams. Aboard the cruiser, the ether itself had turned poison. The psychic harmony that bound the crew in a functioning hierarchy was shattered, replaced by a wave of pure, unfiltered paranoia, fear, and bloodlust. The reptilian captain, convinced his human first mate was trying to usurp him, lunged across the bridge and tore his throat out with his bare claws. The navigator, suddenly gripped by a soul-crushing terror of the empty space outside her viewport, smashed her own console and began clawing at her eyes. Every being on the ship was consumed by their own darkest impulses. A symphony of violence and madness that ended only when the ship's overloaded reactor, neglected in the chaos, finally breached. The vessel tore itself apart in a flash of silent, ugly fire. Grand Luminarch Orin had observed the test from the Chamber of Resonance, the psychic feedback reaching even his sanctum as a wave of spiritual nausea. He felt the stain of it, the ugly, jagged wound it left in the great song. "You have created a horror. Archon Vex," he chimed, his voice heavy with sorrow. Vex appeared before him as a projection, her fractured light unapologetic. "I have created a weapon that will work," she countered. "The enemy is a void. We cannot fill it with our light, so we will fill it with a noise so terrible that even the void will break." Her new flagship, too, the scream of defiance, was now armed with this weapon. An entire fleet, the last great hope of the Ascendancy, was being refitted, their harmonious lances replaced with these dissonant abominations. They were no longer a choir. They were a banshee wail, preparing to meet silence with insanity. Aboard the Abaddon, the final preparations were underway for a very different kind of apocalypse. In the heart of the ship, in a fabrication bay so vast it had its own internal gravity, the Silence engine was complete. It was an immense, multi-pronged spire of black, non-reflective metal, a construct designed for a single, terrifying purpose. It was not a weapon that destroyed matter or energy. It was a weapon that destroyed belief. Kalen stood on an observation deck, watching the final power conduits connect. The engine was the culmination of everything he had learned from the vivisection of the Symphony of Dawn and the deconstruction of Archon Lyran's mind. It was a macro-scale version of the etheric dampener he had used in the interrogation chamber, designed to project a spherical, ever-expanding field of absolute etheric nullity. It did not block the great song. It created a reality where the song had never existed. Anya's hard light form appeared, her data tattoo swirling with new intelligence. The Ascendancy has massed their grand armada at the edge of the Sanctum system. Our scans indicate their ships are emitting a new energy signature, unstable, chaotic. It does not match any known Athelian design. Kalen's optical implants analyzed the incoming data stream, his processors modeling the new energy waves. "They are weaponizing dissonance," he stated, a flicker of something akin to clinical interest in his synthesized voice, a logical, if primitive, response. They seek to fight our silence with noise. It is irrelevant. Their fleet is a distraction." He turned his gaze back to the spire. "Their power is derived from a shared psychic connection to a universal energy field. Their entire civilization, their faith, their very consciousness is built upon the premise that they are not alone. The silence engine will introduce a new, absolute truth to their reality they are." The plan was simple and elegant in its utter brutality. The exile fleet would engage the Ascendancy Armada, a feint to hold their attention. During the chaos, a single stealth vessel would deploy the silence engine in high orbit over Sanctum. Once activated, the null field would expand at the speed of light. Every Ithalian on Sanctum and in the surrounding fleet would be simultaneously and instantly severed from the ether. It would be a psychic decapitation on the scale of an entire species. The resulting shock, Kalen calculated, would collapse their individual minds, leaving behind trillions of empty chitatonic shell. It was not genocide. It was de-authentication. "They will bring a fleet to fight our ships," Kalen murmured, the logic flowing cold and clear. "We are bringing a philosophical argument to end their civilization." Jorik 734 logistics coordinator was becoming a problem, though no one yet knew it. He had exceeded every performance metric, optimizing the resource flow from Lara 7 with a machine-like efficiency that had earned him greater access to the Exile data network. He was a model of compliance, and he was using that access to wage a war no one else could see. His first experiment, the illogical manifest for hope, had been a success. The low-level AI assigned to resolve the paradox had burned out 3 of its logic processors before a higher-function AI simply flagged the entry as corrupted data and deleted it. But the infection had taken root. Jorik realized he couldn't fight their logic, but he could poison it with ambiguity. He began subtly altering historical and cultural data files being uploaded from Lara 7's archives. In a text on metallurgy, he would insert a line of poetry about a sword having a soul. In a schematic for an old fusion reactor, he would add a religious annotation about the divine spark of creation. He embedded fragments of myths, prayers, and paradoxes into thousands of otherwise sterile data logs. They were tiny, insignificant acts of defiance, digital graffiti that the exile systems, in their search for usable data, were forced to process. The AIs couldn't understand it, but they couldn't ignore it. Concepts like honor, sacrifice, and infinity were entering their networks not as definitions to be learned, but as illogical variables in practical equations. The cumulative effect was a minute, almost immeasurable slowdown in their processing efficiency. The perfect machine was developing a stutter, a fractional hesitation as its processors wasted cycles trying to quantify the unquantifiable. Jorik had no idea if it would be enough to matter. He was one man planting weeds in a global garden of perfect concrete, but it was his war, fought with the only weapon he had, the stubborn, logical soul of his species. The 2 fleets faced each other across the void. In one side, the Ascendancy's Grand Armada, their golden ships now pulsing with a feverish, unstable violet light, their harmonious hum replaced by a low, angry growl. At their head was the scream of defiance, Archon Vex ready to unleash a psychic plague upon the universe to save her people. On the other, the Exile fleet, a silent formation of black, geometric shapes, cold and impassive. In their midst, the Abaddon held its secret weapon. Kalen prepared to extinguish the soul of a galaxy. It was a confrontation of impossible philosophies. One side had embraced madness to fight the silence. The other had perfected silence to combat a faith it could not comprehend. As the first lances of violet chaos energy screamed across the void towards the impassive black ships, and as the exile stealth ship slipped past the battle lines towards the shimmering globe of Sanctum, the war reached its final, terrible turning point. One sought to erase their god, the other to save it by becoming a demon. The silent void was about to learn the true meaning of noise. The void between the two fleets became a canvas of competing impossibilities. Archon Vex gave the order, and the Grand Armada screamed. Lances of pure, weaponized madness, churning beams of violet chaos tore across space. They were not aimed at hulls or shields. They were aimed at the synthetic minds of the exile crews. Aboard the Abaddon, Kalen's bridge remained silent, but the data streams flooding his consciousness became a torrent of corrupted logic. The dissonant energy didn't induce fear or paranoia in his machine-augmented crew, but it functioned as a near-perfect denial of service attack. Their processors, designed for cold, sequential logic, were overwhelmed by the sheer irrationality of the psychic assault. Targeting solutions flickered, navigation vectors became unreliable, and communication between ships developed a fatal lag. For the first time, the perfect exile network began to fray, not from damage, but from confusion. In response, the exile fleet fired. There was no answering scream, only the cold, hard math of destruction. Gravity wells crushed golden battleships into incandescent pearls of matter. Hypersonic slugs, guided by struggling targeting systems, punched clean, silent holes through vessels that were still broadcasting psychic horror. The battle was a maelstrom of light and silence, a war between a species that had weaponized its soul and one that had perfected its absence of one. As the chaos raged, the stealth ship, the Voidnail, slipped through the battle lines, its dark hull invisible to Athelian sensors. It achieved high orbit over Sanctum, a world shimmering with a desperate, collective prayer. The Silence engine began its deployment sequence, the long, black spires unfurling like the petals of a dead flower. The countdown to psychic annihilation had begun. It was then that the stutter in the Exile network became a seizure. On Lyra 7 Jorik's digital ghosts, which had been a minor annoyance, suddenly became a catastrophic contagion. The AIs trying to process the Athelian chaos attack were the same ones purging Jorik's illogical data packets. The combined strain was too much. The network, in a desperate act of self-preservation, began to quarantine its own corrupted logic centers, severing connections between the fleet, the Voidnail, and the command hub on the Abaddon. Kalen watched in cold disbelief as his perfect command structure fractured. The deployment of the Silence engine stalled, its activation sequence frozen at 97%. Yet on the bridge of the Scream of Defiance, Lumina Vex felt the shift. The relentless and perfectly coordinated assault of the exiles faltered, becoming disjointed, and through the psychic static, she felt a new, cold terror emanating from her home world. In that moment of clarity, she saw the truth. The battle was a feint. The true weapon was not a ship. It was an idea, aimed at the heart of her people. "All power to the engines," she commanded, her voice a shard of ice. "Bring us about. We are going home." Her crew, lost in the bloodlust of their dissonant weapons, barely registered the order, but the ship responded. The Scream of Defiance, the Ascendancy's greatest sin, turned from the battle and accelerated toward Sanctum on a desperate, final charge. Kalen saw it happen on his tactical display. A single Athelian ship breaking formation, its chaotic energy signature a burning spear aimed at his true objective. His logic dictated the optimal course of action, sacrifice the stalled engine, recall the void nail, and withdraw to recalculate. It was the efficient, pragmatic choice. But as his processors struggled to reestablish network stability, they kept flagging the source of the corruption, illogical data originating from the otherwise compliant asset Jorik 734. The variables of faith, hope, and soul that he had dismissed as meaningless were the very things that had crippled his perfect weapon. It was an unacceptable paradox. An illogical, inefficient organism had defeated a system of pure reason. For the first time, a new command entered Kalen's decision matrix, one that was not born of logic, but of a cold, burning need to understand this new variable. He would not retreat. He overrode the network safeties, shunting all remaining processing power from the entire fleet to a single point, the void nail. His command was simple: force activation. Now! As the scream of defiance screamed into orbit over Sanctum, it saw the silence engine pulsing, ready to fire. Vex knew she was too late to stop it. She had only one option left. She aimed her ship not at the void nail, but at the spire of the engine itself. "Archon!" her first mate cried, his form flickering with terror. "The feedback will destroy us." "Our souls are already lost," Vex replied, a strange, final serenity in her voice. "Let our end have meaning." She fired. A full, concentrated blast from the dissonance cannon, a universe of screaming madness, struck the silence engine at the exact nanosecond Kalen's forced command activated it. The weapon of perfect noise met the weapon of perfect silence. The result was not an explosion of matter, but a detonation of concept. A shockwave of utter contradiction radiated outwards from Sanctum. The expanding sphere of the null field, designed to erase the ether, was shattered from within by the dissonant blast. The ether was not erased. It was broken on Sanctum. Grand Luminarch Orin and every Ethelian felt it. The great song, the constant, unifying hum of their collective consciousness, and did not fade to silence. It shattered into a trillion, billion discordant chimes. It was the sound of a god dying and a people being born. The telepathic unity was gone, replaced by a deafening roar of individual thoughts, fears, and hopes. For the first time in their history, every Ethelian was utterly, terrifyingly alone in their own mind, left with only a faint, fractured echo of the song they once knew. The feedback loop annihilated both the scream of defiance and the void nail, the psychic backlash frying every active system in the exile fleet and sending a catastrophic data crash through their crippled network. Kalen was thrown back from his command throne not by a physical force, but by the sheer, illogical static of a billion new souls screaming into existence. His optical implants went dark. His neural processors flatlined. The last data point he registered was a single, corrupted file that had finally broken through his firewalls. It was a line of ancient human poetry Jorik had embedded in a mineral manifest. "We are the music makers, and we are the dreamers of dreams." The exile fleet, leaderless and broken, began a slow, silent retreat into the dark, leaving behind a changed galaxy. On Lyra 7, the exile occupation collapsed overnight, their machines falling silent, their cyborg overseers standing motionless. Jorik 734 stepped out from the logistics hub and looked up at a sky that was no longer filled with the golden light of distant gods or the menacing dark of silent machines. It was just a quiet, star-dusted sky, filled with a new, uncertain silence. The ascendancy was gone, its people shattered into individuals who would now have to learn how to sing alone. The exiles were crippled, forced to retreat and confront a variable their logic could.